My name is Jaivin. I'm the director of this institute. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that today's event is being held on the land of the Darug people of the Darug Nation, and their ancestors have been the traditional owners of the land for thousands of years. And I would like to pay our respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. A bit of intro for myself. I came to Australia from Beijing in early 1988 and received my PhD in English literature from University of Sydney in 1995. I've worked at various places, including New South Wales Attorney General's Department as Violent Victim Compensation Manager, and at SBS as the Chief Subtitler and Head of the Subtitling Department for 23 years. And I've been teaching at Western Sydney University since 2006. I'd like to acknowledge the support of the people who are here today, including Professor Jocelyn Che, the founding director of this institute, and the adjunct professor of this institute. And Sally Pomon, who is the advisory board member of this institute. And we have a few people who are running late, so I may not mention them after they come back. I think Da Peng is supposed to be here, who is the artist of the exhibition there, and that's what we are showing. And I will introduce Peter Tsai shortly. China is a country of 4.1 billion people and of a huge diversity. A unique place filled with rapid changes and presenting a wide range of living conditions and lifestyles. So we are very excited today to launch My China Story, a conversation series with Australians who have lived and worked in China for extensive period of time to share their lived experiences and knowledge of China. For the inaugural conversation of My China Story, we are thrilled and greatly honored to have the renowned author, sinologist, essayist, cultural commentator, Chinese film and literature translator, and of many other roles, Linda Jaivin. Linda has so many amazing, incredible stories. So I believe today we are facing the real challenge of creating the shortest version of Linda Jaivin's story. Today, we are very privileged and honored to have the CEO of the National Foundation for Australian-China Relations, Mr. Peter Tsai, to open this inaugural conversation. Peter has extensive experience in business, media, academia, and government. He was the Group Chief Advisor and the General Manager for Strategic Relations at Virgin Australia, Research Fellow at Lowy Institute, journalist with The Age, the Australian and Sydney Morning Herald. Please welcome Peter Tsai for the opening.
Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone, sorry. It is an honor and a privilege to be invited here as the speaker to give the opening remark to this a fantastic program. As Professor Han Jing has mentioned, my name is Peter. I'm the CEO of the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations. The foundation was created back in 2019 as a national platform to provide practical and constructive engagement with China. The government has provided the foundation with $45 million over 5 years. You know it is pretty serious when it's backed by generous funding. When Professor Han Jing approached me to provide opening remark to this story, immediately the concept appeals to me immensely. As a former journalist myself, I very much like the idea of the storytelling. One of my mentors at the Sydney Morning Herald, the famous economic writer Ross Gitton, has always said to me many times that storytelling is deeply wired into the human DNA. Imagine our ancestors during all these dark, endless nights without electricity, entertainment. We spend endless night gossip. So storytelling become one of the most primitive but yet the most penetrating form of communication. So I'm really glad that Professor Han Jing choose to use storytelling as this amazing tool to tackle and understand a subject matter that is complex, is rich, as dynamic as China. And also, in my role as the CEO of the National Foundation, another aspect of this program really appeals to me is the ability to tell the people-to-people story. When I first joined the foundation, one of the key mandates is to promote people-to-people relationship. This concept seems a bit warm and fuzzy and a bit elusive, hard to define. As someone who has worked on commercial relationship, look at international relations, the hard power, it is a concept I think is a bit elusive. But however, just in the last 6 months in my job, I have met hundreds of people in a different engagement. I have truly come to appreciate this concept of a people-to-people relationship. I'm just going to share with you very briefly some of my favorite stories about the people-to-people relationship, how it is so important, so central to our understanding of Australia-China relationship. I think I'll start with the first one, Professor Peter Doherty, one of a Nobel Prize winner and one of Australia's most preeminent immunologists. And in fact, he has been working with the head of the China Centre of Disease Control over the last decades. And Professor George Gall even translated his book. And also another famous Australian immunologist, Sir Gustav Nossel, has been providing trainings and helping China to set up laboratories since 1970s, at a time when China was just recovering from the madness of the Cultural Revolution, was a dirt poor country. And now, I mean, that provided a foundation for now this very rich and deep cooperation between Australia and China when it comes to medical research. So these things going back decades. I won't speak for too long, but I can't resist the temptation to share one last story with you before I pass on to a much more interesting story about Linda, which is when I met Mr. David Lee of the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra, the chairman of the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra, he told me the story about how he came to Australia on Australia-China Council Scholarship back in 1982, I think. One of the very first music students to come to study Australia. And over the last 4 decades, he first became a very successful musician, then a very successful businessman, and now he's the first Asian heritage chairman of any major Western orchestra anywhere in the world. I just think from the very small seed and capital we provided 40 years ago, a small venture capital invested by Australian government, and we create, we fund a fabulous young man, a musician, and he's becoming a very successful citizen in this country. And through his good office of MSO, he has built this amazing program of East-West culture exchange, and also acknowledge Professor Jocelyn Che, the former executive director of Australia-China Council. Even though we're a relatively younger organization, we can also claim the very rich historical lineage because of our historical predecessor, Australia-China Council. On a very, on the back of that very interesting story, I will pass on to Professor Han Jing and Linda. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter, for your great stories, and that set the tone for this session. Yes, they are full of stories, and for Jaivin, I have to mention that I actually first came to Australia because I got a scholarship from Australian China Council, so that tells all the stories. For the limited time we have with Linda, and I'm applying my subtitling skills of being succinct and concise. So I have asked Linda to give a 15 minutes long presentation, followed by our 30 minutes short conversation, and hopefully we can manage a few questions from the audience. So please welcome Linda Jaivin to give the presentation.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Jean. Thank you, Peter. And thank you, Jocelyn, for coming. I see a number of old friends here. I'm very, very happy about that. It's very hard. I'm asked to sum up my China life in 15 minutes. My China life began rather accidentally when I was in university, and I was going to study political science. This is at Brown University in the United States. Brown University encourages people to explore and do other courses. I was looking for some others for my very first year. Somebody recommended, well, I chose physics for non-physics majors, which absolutely confirmed my inability to do science as a major. It was good to do once. And a bunch of other ones, in Latin and so on. I was like, I asked somebody, and I wish I could remember their name because they changed my life. I asked an upperclassman who I knew, can you just recommend a course that I want to do something I might never have thought of doing, and the main thing is the teacher has to be very good. It has to be a lively teacher. And they said, well, have you ever thought of taking East Asian history? Lee Williams' introductory course to East Asian history is fantastic. I had honestly never, ever thought about that. I was an environmental activist as a high school student. I was very interested in politics. I loved reading. I had, as a child, wanted to be a librarian because I thought that the job involved sitting around in the library all day and reading books, which later I discovered it didn't. At that time, it never occurred to me that I might be one of the people to write the books. Anyway, when I graduated, it was in 1977, and unlike Australia, which was much more advanced and had proper relations with the People's Republic of China, the United States, at the time I only had American citizenship. I'm much, much happier as an Australian, I can tell you that. But we did not have the possibility of going to mainland China. So I thought, what do I do now? I've taken this. Also, I have to say, Lee Williams said, very early on, he said, you have to take Chinese. And I said, I can't take Chinese. I did really poorly in French in high school. I'm really bad at languages. And he said, if you don't take Chinese, you're never going to understand China, and it's useless to study the history. It's ridiculous. Like, you just should not do that. And I was like, oh. And then I took Chinese, and I loved it. So I thank Lee Williams almost every day of my life for that, because it just blew my mind and opened my world. So when I was approaching graduation, there weren't that many pathways. I mean, you could go on and do a doctorate. I really wanted to see the world. I wanted to see China in particular. Or you could become a diplomat, and I'm not very diplomatic, never was. Or you could become a spy, and I'm so unsuited for that. So I thought, what am I going to do? So I thought, well, I'll go to Taiwan and keep studying Chinese. That'll be something I can put off. You know, what do you want to do when you grow up? I can just study Chinese for a while. So I did. But when I went there, I did have this thought, having studied Chinese history for 4 years. I thought, Chinese history, every time I said to somebody I'm studying Chinese history, they'd be like, wow, you know, nobody knew anything about Chinese history. And I thought, one day, I don't know how I'm going to do it because I don't know how you become a writer, but I am going to write a popular history of China. And of course, at the time I thought this, I really knew nothing about China. I'd studied it. I studied the history generally for 4 years from zero, like seriously zero knowledge. For 4 years, it doesn't count. You know, Shirley Pimal, you know what you'd say. I seriously knew nothing. But I went to Taiwan, and I found Taiwan so charming, and I was so happy. You know, it was the sort of place at the time, it was under martial law, so it was really weird. Like, we had to, if we wanted to stay on talking and drinking in a bar, you knew the right bars, like Shansu, and they would at whatever time curfew set in, we'd all have to leave. They'd pull down the blackout curtains. We'd walk around the back, wait 5 minutes, be let in, and then play Pac-Man and stuff like that till dawn. Martial law was intense. There were a lot of political prisoners. There was a lot of really bad shit going on. But as a place to live and study, it was so charming. You would go out. This is in the middle of Taipei, in the morning in your pajamas, like all the neighbors, and your Japanese clogs, the wooden kind of clogs that they had there. And you'd kind of shuffle down the street with a pot in your hand and go to the corner where they were making doujiang, and they also made all kinds of tofu and dried tofu and all this stuff. and you would take your pot and you would get the fresh doujiang and take it home. Or you could go out in the morning and all the Shandong Lao, being all the old soldiers from Shandong, were running doujiang and youtiao stalls for breakfast, and it was so nice, and I made these great friends. And among my best friends there were a few guys who were in a cover band. I don't know how I'm going to keep this into 15 minutes, but anyway, they were in a cover band. They played in a place called Idea House. Idea House was one of the cradles of what the Xiaoyuan Mingge movement, the campus folk movement. And so I would go all the time with these friends of mine. I lived with one of them and his brother and his mother. His mother was from Hunan, and when she cooked for us, she always made 2 versions of the same dish, because her dish was basically just chilies. And even her children couldn't cope with that. I mean, what she made for us was really spicy, but what she ate for herself, and she said, oh, if it's not like this, I can't taste it, you know. And so we would go and we'd hang out at Idea House. I heard all of these great singers. I kind of witnessed the beginning of this thing that was still illegal because of Taiwan's martial law, to talk about Taiwan identity. And they were singing about it. Mei Li Dao was one of the songs. It was a very interesting time. I learned so much. I moved to Hong Kong and became a journalist. I met Ho De-jian on one of his visits to Hong Kong. He was a Taiwan folk singer, part of that movement. I knew who he was. He had written Long de Tuanren, Heirs of the Dragon, which was huge. And I met him by going to kind of a forum like this in the Hong Kong Art Center. And he was talking with these Cantonese who were struggling along to speak in Mandarin to him. And I was sitting there, I was the only non-Chinese person and the only non-Cantonese, I think, in the audience. Because whenever he made a joke, I was the only one who laughed. And anyway, I kept thinking from his sense of humor, he's like all my best friends in Taiwan. He and I could be best friends. And then I told myself, oh, don't be an idiot. He's a famous big star. I'm sitting here like, you know that thing when you think, oh yeah, like, you know, okay, Blanchett and I, we'd be like this, you know, if I could only meet her. You know, that kind of weird thing, you know, Fan Bingbing, I'm sure we would get along, you know. And so I kind of went down, afterwards, all these people were going down and asking for his photograph. And I kind of went down, and then I thought, oh no, I'm not going to do this. I'm just not going to do this. So I began to turn around, and he went, 等一下. I was like, me? And he's like, yeah. And he goes, 贵姓. And something, because I had an intuition about what he was like, I just had an intuition, I just went, 毕姓贾, right? My humble surname is Jia. And he laughed, and he said, don't go. Anyway, that was the start of an incredible friendship that also led to me, that lasted for years, that got me banned from Taiwan for a whole lot of time, that ended up with me harboring him, Liu Xiaobo, and Gao Xin after Tiananmen with Nick Jose in Nick Jose's apartment. I snuck Ho De-jian into the Australian embassy. We actually drove in a friend's car. We drove, this is like 3 days after Liu Si, after the 4th of June. We drove into the embassy. I was wearing a big skirt. I always wore these big skirts. And Ho De-jian was on the floor of the back seat under my skirt. That's how we snuck him in. And I did write a book about that. It's called The Monkey and the Dragon. I wrote a book about Ho De-jian and his life, and what his life and his family says about Taiwan and China and the history of all of that. So that was a big part of my life. Through Ho De-jian, I also met Yang De-chang, Luo Daiyou, Hou Xiaoxian, and a whole bunch of other people who were crucial people in the Taiwan. This is before, obviously, he went to China and Taiwan wouldn't let him back in. But I met all of these people. I met Edward Young when he was, he already knew, I think, that he was going to get the Palme d'Or at Cannes. He was wearing a t-shirt that said Bresson, Fassbinder, Young. And he was a young filmmaker with hardly anything that he'd actually done. He was amazing. I still have a poster of Lord Ayo that I actually stole off the wall of Yang de Chang's home when he stupidly lent me his house to stay there. Sorry. So Lord Ayo helped me steal it, by the way. And by then I was working for Asia Week magazine, living in Hong Kong, hanging out with Hong Kong filmmakers like Xuanhua, An Hui, and Xu Ke, Cui Hak, and all of that. I also covered the whole course of the Sino-British negotiations over Hong Kong, and I asked Margaret Thatcher a question that threw her, and that caused a whole bunch of columns to be written in the Chinese newspapers of Hong Kong. That was my most triumphant moment as a journalist. Otherwise, I was a little bit, I don't know, I was more interested in culture than in politics, but that was my great moment, was actually throwing Margaret Thatcher, so I'm very proud of that. In the early 80s in China, I met Jeremy Barmay, introduced me to Yang Xianyi, Gladys, Huang Miaozi, Yu Feng, Wu Zuguang, Xin Fengxia, all of these older, like the last literati, the people who, the final generation in China who had a classical, real traditional education, but also had come through, the Cultural Revolution, and they had been underground communist workers, but they've been terribly punished in the Cultural Revolution. They were amazing. I would spend so much time with them. I also had younger friends, including Xian, who's now a very well-known Australian artist. I knew him from the early 80s because I went out for a little while with one of his friends who was a member of the Stars, one of that group. And then I spent the rest of the time crying on Xian's shoulder. That's how I got to know Xian. So I somehow got to know all of these amazing people, and I would spend so many nights at Yang Xianyi's house. I would go to Wu Zuguang, the opera playwright, his house all the time. He used to take me out to Peking Opera, taught me everything, how to appreciate Peking Opera. I developed a huge love of Peking Opera, and eventually in 2010 wrote a fusion Peking Opera, Western Opera, under the mentorship of the president of the National Peking Opera Company of China. And that project fell apart, as so many projects do, but we still have a few. We did get a little bit of performance, not the whole opera, but we have a full libretto, a full thing with music, and it's never been fully performed. Oh well. So, just a few more little, do I have time to just do a little bit more? Yes? Okay. You see a picture up? Oh, you don't see a picture up there. There was a picture up there before, and I was with three men. Some of you might recognize them. Chen Kaige, Zhang Yimou, and Huang Jianxin. We were at a Hong Kong film festival, and the story, that's the backstory to this, is that when Chen Kaige, when he made Huang Tudi, his first film, Yellow Earth, with Zhang Yimou as the cinematographer, this is before social media. Young people have a very hard time understanding this, but you didn't actually know what people looked like half the time, right? You really didn't. You didn't have their Instagram photos. You didn't have anything. And so I was so excited. I was so into film. I knew this film was going to be playing, and I heard a rumor that maybe the director and cinematographer were going to be allowed to get out of China. It was very restrictive at the time, super restrictive. Maybe they were going to come to Hong Kong. I was sitting on the MTR in Hong Kong, and I was reading a book, and I read Chinese novels, and I read English novels, and I read, whatever. I happened to be reading an English novel. I'm sitting there, and across from me, at that time, you never heard Mandarin in Hong Kong, there was nobody there who spoke Mandarin. You'd never hear it. And across from me were these three people, and they were speaking Mandarin, but not just Putonghua. They were speaking Beijing Hua. They were speaking Beijing dialect. And I was like, oh my God. So I didn't look up. I kind of looked up, but then I was like pretending to read my book and listening to them. And they were talking about 咱们厂, which is very Beijing for like our 厂, could be anything. But I knew they were talking about the film studio, the Beijing film studio. I guessed it was the Beijing film studio, 咱们厂. And they started talking about films and stuff, and I'm thinking, ooh. So I said, I put down my book and I said, 冒昧地问一下. And they went, because they thought I was just some dumb foreigner reading an English book sitting there. Anyway, which I was a dumb foreigner, but I actually understood, so they were half right. Anyway, so I said, can I ask? I said, I know that, Huang Tudi is playing at the film festival, 听说陈凯歌导演和张艺谋摄影师都要来, that they were coming. And I said, do you happen to know if that's true? And they looked at me like this. And one of them went, 我是陈凯歌, I'm 陈凯歌. And the other one went, 我是张艺谋. I was like, I'm 张艺谋. I'm like, oh, hello. Anyway, long story short, I now have translated probably most of Chiang Kai-shek's films. I've translated a couple of Zhang Yimou's. Jing is amazing. I've translated quite a few Chinese movies. It's one of my things. I've written 12 books, not all of them on China, but the last one is the shortest history of China, and we meant to have it here. But if you saw me looking worried beforehand, that was because we were trying to find out from my publisher what was going on and what's going on as the books haven't arrived. But we will later give you a code, a special code, that if you want to, you can order the book and get a discount. So apologies for that. But anyway, all these years later, I blah, 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 blah. Lots to say, and the basic thing I want to end with is my experiences in all three places, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and China, reinforced to me, I haven't rattled on too long, have I? Reinforced to me the importance of history in understanding China, the importance of culture to understanding history, and the absolute centrality of language to understanding both history and culture. And I also saw how history was written in China and what was missing, including a lot of the women most of the time, and also what got changed from time to time. I had a friend who worked at the National, it was either the National Library or the Archives in China, and one of his jobs was to cut some people out of photos in books, and the other job was to paste others back in. Because they never threw them away completely. They actually knew what they were doing. This is way before Photoshop. And look, in Taiwan, under martial law, when we used to get Time magazine, every time there was a picture of Deng Xiaoping or anybody, it had Gongfei, communist bandit, stabbed across their faces. Gongfei, Gongfei, Gongfei. And then I remember I worked for a little magazine and we ordered an Encyclopedia Britannica, because this is way before internet and Wikipedia, and it came with like the entry on Mao was covered with stickers that, I can't remember, I don't think they said Gongfei, I think they just said Republic of China, Republic of China, Republic of China, like this. And so my colleagues and I at the magazine spent a lot of time steaming off the stickers. I've seen how museums in China to this day poorly or only partially label or actually lie in the labels on things. I realized only after a very long time that after going to all these temples in China that the Buddhas that I saw in particular temples, I learned later, were not the original Buddhas in these famous temples, because those Buddhas had been smashed to smithereens by Red Guards. Those Buddhas were taken from other temples and put there, and nobody ever tells you this. I saw how, for example, the last time I went to the Museum of Revolutionary History, there was one photograph to represent the 10 years of the Cultural Revolution. And the caption was completely mystifying. It said something about, it was a Fangeming Bao Dong. I can't even remember what it said. It just made no sense. It was like a counter-revolutionary incident or something. I can't even remember, but it was just ridiculous. 10 years of people's lives, 10 years of violence, 10 years of craziness, 10 years, 10 very important years, that just got reduced for today's purposes to one photograph. I wrote a book about Beijing, which had a short history of Beijing, and that book, I basically searched a whole lot of bookshops in China, in Beijing in particular, for Beijing history books, and I bought quite a few, but they all kind of pretty much stopped at 1949. So everything that happened in Beijing after 1949 was not a story that was supposed to be told. So that was extremely interesting. And so I wanted to write something that would, when I got this opportunity to write this book, the book that I wanted to write since I was a university student, I wanted to write something that would not ignore the politics of history, but that could transcend these politics of history, mainly by acknowledging them. So it's a little bit like in plays when you break down the fourth wall. I wanted to acknowledge that people look at Confucius in many different ways, and they always have, for example. I wanted to do justice to the many, many, many great women of Chinese history who often get left out of general histories, the inventors, the feminists, the warriors. There's not just Mulan, there's many, many others. I wanted to address China's diversity because it has tremendous diversity, and that's often overlooked when people talk about China today as like the Chinese, as if that covers 1.4 billion people. I wanted to write a book for people, whether they knew China or not, whether they were Chinese or not, that they could get something out of this book that perhaps they didn't know before, that it would be that you could approach it from zero knowledge or more. It was basically to fulfill the dream that I'd had as a university student encountering that history for the first time. And that's my very, very, very shortest history of my history of China, of my history in China. Thank you.
Well, I knew around the risk when I told Linda that at 15 minutes, I'm sure it's not going to be 15 minutes, but we continue the story. As I said, Linda just has so many interesting stories. And Linda didn't show me the presentation beforehand, and I didn't show her the questions I'm going to ask. So only 2 bits that are overlapped. The rest is actually none being overlapped. The one overlapped is you met Zhang Yimou, and that fantastic story. Okay, let's continue the conversation. You covered quite a bit about the Taiwan, which I actually wanted to ask about. You covered a lot, but it's quite interesting. I just want to cover the other side of the 1970s in China. We always talk about liberate the treasure island, 解放台湾, and in Taiwan they talk about
光复大陆.
Yeah, 光复大陆, recover the mainland. I knew in your book, The Monkey and the Dragon, which is a fantastic book. I highly recommend it. It's out of a print.
It's an ebook.
Yeah, ebook, but it's really interesting. And in that book, you mentioned there was a joke in Taiwan. People say, when will you return the money that you borrow from me? Oh, when we recover the mainland.
So that was another joke too, and that was on all the buses and when you went to the movies and everything, there was always these signs that said, they said, 共匪无孔不入. Right? There's no hole into which a communist bandit cannot crawl, right? And it gave you a kind of a reporting for, it was a hotline for reporting communist bandits, in case you found any. And so because I was young then and everybody I knew was young, and so everybody, I mean, you can imagine the jokes about 共匪无孔不入, you know,
yeah.
I won't go into them. But
Yeah, it was really interesting because to see the other side that we didn't get to see, you know, growing up in mainland China. So that was fascinating. But I have a question for you. Is in your book, The Monkey and the Dragon, which I just recommended, it's really interesting. It's a very Linda style. It's very humorous and very fun. And you said China had stood up all right. The problem was her people would not have a chance to sit down and take a break for many decades, which was so true. So in 1980, because you always wanted to go to mainland China, but you couldn't. So in 1980, on your 25th birthday, it's important to know how young she was at the time. So you finally went through the door opened by Deng Xiaoping to Guangzhou for the first time. What was the thing that struck you the most about China that you had in mind?
Well, I think the most striking thing from that very little trip was I managed to break away from the group. You always have to go to a group. And I went walking around People's, I think they called it People's Park at the time, or Yuan Gongyuan, I can't remember what it was. Anyway, I met this guy and he was like, oh, can I walk with you? And I was like, yeah, sure. How amazing, I'm actually talking to a real mainland Chinese, you know. So natural in Hong Kong and Taiwan and so forbidden then, really was. And so he said, can I walk with you? I said, sure. So we start walking in the park. And he says, and he's asking me all these questions, and I'm telling him, I live in Hong Kong, you know. And I say, so what do you do? And he said, he teaches, he taught Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought. I thought, oh my God, that is the best, right? Like, this is the real thing, this is the real deal. I've actually met someone who teaches Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought. And so I was asking about that, and he was telling me a little bit. We walk in the park. And we walk up to the top, and we sit down for a little, just a little break on a park bench. And he throws himself on me and tries to stick the tongue down my throat. And I was like, whoa, you know. And he says, please marry me, take me out of here. I was like, well, I don't think so. I'm gonna bust again. Yeah, but that really made a very strong impression on me.
Thank you, that's a very good story. It's not uncommon though, that's a great story. I'm so pleased that I asked that question. So the next question kind of related because you went to first to Taiwan, then Hong Kong, then mainland China, you lived there and worked there. And you have met and made friends with so many Chinese people, including artists, musicians, writers, filmmakers, editors, cartoonists, academics, dissidents, and ordinary citizens, as you just mentioned.
Normal.
Chinese people tend to refer non-Chinese as foreigner, 外国人, or 老外. So what do you think it is in you that helped to break down that racial and cultural barrier?
I don't know, I kind of wanted to be Chinese when I first went to Taiwan. I was like, oh, I want to be Chinese. And I didn't want to see other foreigners. I was a little bit like Backhouse, Edmund Backhouse. I don't know if you know about him, but he used to ride around his rickshaw in like the 1940s, and if he saw a foreigner, he'd hold up his handkerchief so he didn't have to see them. I was a little bit like that, very stupid. I think it's language, really, and also the fact that it's not just language, because a lot of people go there and they learn a bit of Chinese, but if you can actually know a little bit of the culture and the history, and you're really interested not just in ancient culture, not just in stuff that's happened in the past, but in what's going on right now, then you have a connection, because I was genuinely interested in the cinema and the art and everything else. So it wasn't really about cultural difference, it was, we were all interested in the same thing.
I think this genuine interest makes all the difference. It's like children, children know you are genuinely interested in them or not, intuitively. You can't pretend. When you pretend, they stay away from you. So this is a really good thing. I think one of the students in this audience, and Mick probably will be very interested in knowing this, how you actually get into Chinese culture. Your interest in China not only brought you to Taiwan, Hong Kong, and mainland China, also turned you into Australia. Because you met an Australian sinologist, Jeremy Barmain, in China and got married in 1986. And you actually had a honeymoon in Tibet. Anyway, so you came back to Canberra, then you went back to China in 1987. This time as a much relaxed freelancer of multiple roles. One of the roles is to work with the filmmakers that you mentioned, Zhang Yimou and Chen Kaige and the rest. Being a subtitler myself, so I could not resist this opportunity to ask you this question. What is the biggest attraction for you to translate the Chinese films into English?
At first it was just, wow, this is fun, And then it was kind of, once you really get into it, I read another subtitler, I can't remember who it was, but there was a book about subtitling. Not somebody who does Chinese, somebody who does like French or something. And they said that subtitling is like playing 3D Scrabble. And I really find it very relaxing. Not relaxing when the director's like, this has to be done yesterday and I've just finished it today. That's not relaxing. But there's something really lovely about that process, because subtitle translation, as Jean knows, it's not like normal translation of, say, a story or a document. You really have to, it's a time-based thing. And so if somebody says a whole lot of stuff really fast, you have to figure out how to put enough words and the right words on the screen that convey the most important things. And so anyway, I began to develop my own theories of subtitling. I just find it really, also because a lot of my other work is creative, it relies on me. Am I doing this right? Is that okay? Is the sound all right where you are? Okay. So I found that, you know, I don't have to think up the story, they've thought up the story. And I don't have to sit with somebody's novel that I'm going to find a lot of flaws with for 300 pages until I hate it, translating it, you know. If I hate a movie, it is going to come to an end, you know, 2 hours later. Well, as a subtitler, not quite 2 hours later, but maybe like a month later, as opposed to, you know, putting your whole, you know, everything into it.
Yeah, but what's specific about Chinese films that
Well,
you like
the
the
only
most?
ones I know. I mean, I can't subtitle from Vietnamese.
Oh, okay. No.
Or Russian.
Yeah, I so relate to what Linda said about the subtitling films. Yes, like no matter how you dislike in a way, I mean, challenge is always language-wise, and also it's coming to an end.
It's like playing Wordle.
Yes, that's right. It's really fascinating and quite interesting, I have to say. It's quite addictive. And also, once you're doing that, you're really rare to translate in books, because books, as you said, take forever, and if you don't like it, you're stuck.
And the other thing about translating Chinese film is, especially when a film is interesting, and most of them are, you know, even the ones that aren't great are interesting, for whatever reason, you really get, because you're doing such a close reading of it, because you're watching it like scenes over and over and over and over again, you begin to see a whole lot of things, and you begin to put things together, and you get a little bit of a reading of deep culture in there, which is so great. You know, you get it. I find it's very enriching. I like it.
It is. My next question is, the 1980s was probably the most extraordinary decade in modern history of China. During those 10 years, China experienced the explosion of creativity and the intellectual exploration, what we call culture fever, 文化热, and also, you know, most gravest setbacks, including campaign against the spiritual pollution in 1983 and the June 4th. Democracy crackdown in Beijing 1989, which you mentioned. So looking back, what do you miss the most of the 1980s in China?
I miss that really genuine wenhuanre, that sense that there's nothing more important than culture, that it's, you know, it's worth everything to read a poem or to listen to a poem, that there was such passion. This is before anybody really could make money. I remember as a journalist, I interviewed one of the first successful individual entrepreneurs, and they had like one of those machines, they bought one of those machines that could like print photos from negatives in 1 hour. And he lived in Dalian, and I actually went from Beijing to Dalian to interview this guy. I mean, making money just wasn't a thing, right? But people were so passionate about culture, and there was a certain innocence there. It wasn't innocent. It was just people were genuinely devoted to intellectual exploration, creative exploration. It was so exciting. I loved that. I loved it.
It's great. I love all your answers. It's just so responsive, and
But also, if I could just add one more thing. I mean, you had these terrible campaigns that would kind of roll up, like spiritual pollution, or before that, the 1981 campaign against bourgeois liberalism, and then 1987 against bourgeois liberalization. And it was really funny. It was really interesting to see how people kind of, like, whoa, the first one was like, are we going back to the Cultural Revolution? No. And then the second one was like, oh, what's going on? And then I remember by bourgeois liberalization, 1987, I had a birthday in Beijing. And a couple of friends, including Wang Peigong, who was a playwright, Liu Xiaobo, who later got the Nobel Peace Prize and sadly passed away in prison 5 years ago. A bunch of friends invited me, including them, invited me to celebrate my birthday at Donglai Shun in Beijing, in Wangfujing, at a restaurant. And they had got a cake, right? And they had told the people at the cake shop they wanted written on the cake, a post-bourgeois liberalization. And happy birthday. And they wouldn't do it. The people at the cake shop wouldn't do it. So Liu Xiaobo himself wrote a post-bourgeois liberalization and a bunch of other slogans and stuck them all over the top of the cake. Because by then, it had become funny enough that you could actually do this in public. I mean, it wasn't like they wanted everybody in the restaurant to see, but you know what I mean? It was kind of at the point where you could, so it was very interesting to see people kind of growing and becoming more and more bold until, of course, 1989, when they were as bold could be.
So true, so true. I miss that 1980s thing as well. You have been claimed to be one of the best known and most versatile writers in Australia. Lucky us, we have Linda in Australia. There are many sides to your talent. After your long-standing period in China doing various things, in 1995, you published your first novel, Eat Me.
It's not a cookbook.
It's not a cookbook. It is actually a comic and erotic book, which instantly became international bestseller. And I think at one point it was also banned in some parts of the United States.
Marion County, Florida.
And
the library system.
Yeah. You then published another 6 novels and 4 non-fiction books, including Beijing, you just mentioned, which are published in 2014. So 2014 was a kind of last publishing time for you. And then 7 years later, in 2021, you give readers a big surprise. And this time, it is a book of history. As we mentioned before, the shortest history. You can see how well I read this book. So the shortest history of China, you squeezing the beginning of a Huaxia civilization to the contemporary times into 15 chapters.
260
and to be
pages
exact,
from Pangu, Kaitiandi, from the origins of the cosmos to COVID.
Basically, yes, that's right, 250 pages to be exact. It is a remarkable feat to accomplish, to say the least. Can you firstly tell us how this nearly impossible task landed on you and what made you say yes to this task?
That's easy. Black Ink was doing Black Ink, the publisher, is doing a series of the shortest history of. So the first one was the shortest history of Europe. They've got shortest history of England, Germany, etc. And they contacted me and said, would you do shortest history of China? And I was like, oh my God, that's my dream since university, so yes.
Wouldn't it be daunting to you?
Yes, of course. It was terrifying. As soon as I said yes, I went home and went, oh my God, what have I done? And I have shelves and shelves and shelves of books. My home library is just ridiculous because probably most of you have similar, I'm the sort of person who, if there's an earthquake in Sydney, I'm going to be the one who's found dead under piles of books when all my shelves sort of just collapse in. That's definitely the way I'm going. But a lot of them are in history, and it kind of coincided with the beginning of COVID. And so I was kind of lucky that I had my home library, because I just began delving back into books, some of which I had from Brown University. And I wrote 30,000 words more than, I wrote 90,000 and the book had to be 60,000 or less, ideally less. I cut 30,000. So it was a really, really hard, it wasn't easy, but it was fascinating and it was a great journey, and I would suddenly remember I'd totally forgotten something and rush back and put it in. But I was very attentive to women. I just kept thinking, how can I keep women in their proper place, not in their place?
Well, it's a bit like a subtitling. Shorter version takes longer. I remember this story. I always told this story to MD of SBS, trying to get more money for us, to say that this writer wrote a long letter, 9-page letter to a friend, And the end of the letter said, I'm so sorry for writing you this long letter because I don't have a time to write a shorter one. So shorter version takes a longer time, obviously.
Totally.
So the next question obviously inevitably concerns the choice. In your introduction, you said you don't name check all of China's many emperors, 559 by the way, and rebels, thinkers, artists, eccentrics, inventors, politicians, or poets. But you introduce, quote, some of the most influential and interesting ones. Can you elaborate on your selection criteria and how do you define interesting?
Intuitively. It was just to, you know, I mean, there are obviously people who are very important to the story. There's people you cannot leave out. I mean, just for example, you have to have Qin Shi Huang, you have to have Confucius, you have to have Han Feizi, you have to have Wan Li, the emperor, you have to have, I mean, there's too many people, you know, and there's too many events that you have to have that just are terribly important. But then there would be people like, you know, Wang Anshi, who, the Song dynasty was very difficult because the Song dynasty had a lot of really interesting intellectual debates, and that's when Confucianism really got its form as statecraft hammered out. I mean, the Han Wudi emperor was the first to take the ideas of Confucius and go, okay, we're going to craft some ideas about how to run a state on this. And it began to develop, but it was the Song dynasty. And so there's all these people, and I just, actually Jeremy told me I'd forgotten one. Oh my God, I can't believe I forgot him. You know, who I had to put back in. But Wang Anshi interested me because he was going against the general tide. He was somebody who really detested the way that rich people and nobility carried on. He didn't have any time for like fancy rituals and stuff, rituals and rites, which were kind of the basis of Confucian, part of the basis of Confucian statecraft. And he was kind of the sort of person you wouldn't expect to succeed in an imperial court. There's a story which I included of his where the emperor invited his top ministers, and the other ministers hated him and they just kept trying to undermine him, but emperors kept kind of liking him and bringing him back. He's been claimed as a sort of a proto-socialist. He was very interested in people's welfare and granaries and public education and taxing the rich, this sort of thing. Anyway, the emperor had all of his top ministers, and they thought, and there was a pond, and the idea was, they sat down, and at everybody's place there was a bait, like a worm or something. I don't know what the bait was, and they were to catch their own fish, and then that fish would be caught. It was just one of those things which emperors do, I suppose, just for fun. And Wang Anshi couldn't be stuffed doing the fishing, so he just ate the bait.
So you do have to read this book to get the content. I enjoyed it enormously. It's highly readable. It's really interesting. But I will take this opportunity to ask some questions that you cannot find in the book. It's more from behind reading the book. Also, you know, you have done so many interviews and conversations about this book. So the questions I'm going to ask were not asked before. Firstly, you inserted contemporary references into your historical account, which I found really interesting. For example, when describing Mencius, Mengzi philosophy, that people are born with some innate qualities, like it is human nature to desire drink, food, and sex. And you drew a reference to An Li's well-known film, Eat, Drink, Man, Woman, 饮食男女, to illustrate Mencius' views. And there are many other examples like that. What is the reason behind this approach?
Because those things pop into my head, and I think that I'm not an academic, I don't have theory for any of this stuff. Because when I was, you know, when you read, like for example, you read about Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of Qin, who was a very famous tyrant. And I could have written, there were a number of assassination attempts on his life and blah, blah, blah. But I thought it was very interesting because Qin Shi Huang has left such a complicated legacy. It's a legacy where his tyranny was infamous. He burned books, he killed people who, you know, he killed intellectuals, he buried the scholars. I say that that's not actually maybe historic. I won't go into that, but I do go into it there. That he might not have buried the scholars, by the way. He might have just killed them by another means. But it wasn't in. I am going into it. It wasn't in the legal code of the Qin dynasty to bury people to death, to bury them alive. So anyway, who knows? But he definitely killed people. But the thing about Qin Shi Huang that's so interesting is his legacy is really complex, because at the same time he's very valorized for having unified China, unified a little bit of China, which they don't emphasize today in schools. They say unified China. If you look at the map, which I have in here, it actually doesn't include Xinjiang, doesn't include Tibet, doesn't include the Northeast, doesn't include most of the Southeast, doesn't include the Southwest, but a unified China. Anyway, where am I going with this? Yes, so I'm thinking about his very complex legacy, sort of valorized for the unification. And he unified weights and measures and a whole bunch of other things, like axle lengths. Do you know why? Anybody know why he unified the axle lengths? Because in an empire with dirt roads and carts, if you really want to help transportation, you have ruts that the wheels can go in that are the same size. Therefore, if the axles are unified throughout the empire, you can have, you can have good roads, right? Or roads that work. So, I quoted or referred to Zhang Yimou's film Hero because the ending is so fascinating. I did subtitle that one, and I remembered going, what? What's going on here? Because the assassin who goes to assassinate the emperor, Qin Shi Huang, in this film ends up being kind of like, conflicted, like, well, maybe what he did good is better than what he did bad. And he kind of is like, okay, maybe I won't kill him. And of course he gets killed anyway. I mean, the assassin gets killed. But it's such an interesting expression of ambivalence, and an ambivalence that I think has been held about Qin Shi Huang from ancient times to today. So it pops into my head, Zhang Yimou's film, of course.
So yeah, that's lots of things like that. So you connected quite quickly. That's why it's highly readable, and it's really interesting, very engaging. Secondly, you included some small, very small, but illuminating details. For example, Lin Liguo, Lin Biao's son, was a Beatles fan. And the last Emperor Puyi wrote his autobiography with the help of the famous novelist Lao She. And in the section, you call it, Guess Who's Back? You described the Confucius comeback, and said in 2011, people over Beijing woke up one day to discover a 9.5 meter tall statue of Confucius in the Tiananmen Square. And the statue disappeared as suddenly as it appeared. Some citizens joked that Confucius didn't have a Beijing residency permit. 没有户口. So is that because of being a novelist, your eyes are always out to capture those details, interesting but also informing? And did you draw a lot from your lived experiences in China?
Yeah, I don't think, because I didn't live in the Ming Dynasty, I would say probably mostly not. But I do love details. I love good stories. I love things that are illuminating. And I also, when you mentioned Lao She, what I really tried to do throughout as well, and what I really enjoyed doing, is taking a person whose life spans a whole bunch of different time periods, or I would take themes, and a person could be a theme. So I introduced Lao She when the Boxer Rebellion is put down by the eight Allied army, Bagua Lianjun, I can't remember what you call it in English, but that army came in and they were really violent and horrible, and they actually killed Lao She's father, and they either shot or stabbed his dog. He was an infant. So I kind of think, okay, I'm doing this whole Boxer Rebellion thing and the Allied army, and I thought, that's really interesting, right? So I start with Lao She as an infant with his father being murdered by the Allied forces, and then we meet him again as a writer who's writing about the common people and so on. Then we meet him again when it's the new China, and he's writing kind of about Dragonbeard Ditch, about the cleaning up of Beijing's open sewers.
龙须沟.
Yeah, Longxugou. And then we meet him again in the Cultural Revolution when he's basically being tormented by Red Guards to the point where he is either murdered or commits suicide. And then we meet him again as a ghost, in a way, in 1980, after 1989, in 1990, as, and you know, China was, I can't remember if it was still martial law or not, but anyway, Beijing was still very tense, things were really, you know, and Tea House, Lao She's play Tea House was revived. And there's a part in Tea House where there's student demonstrations and there's, you know, and there's this thing where, what is the tea house owner says something basically against the police who are killing the students. Now that's a communist, perfectly good view of history, right? So Tea House was always a very good play as far as the Communist Party went. But at this moment, because it referred to students being killed and how terrible that was, when it was put on in Beijing after 1989, the audiences would applaud. So we have Lao, you know, because they were saying what they couldn't say out loud by applauding that. And so this is very interesting to me. Lao She's story stretches almost a century. It's so interesting. So I would always try to, and Qin Shi Huang kind of comes and goes, you know, and Confucius, oh my God, and Han Feizi, they are there all the time.
Yes, you can see their approach is so interesting. The third point that I want to mention is you use many original texts, including those Chinese sayings, idioms, and especially those popular colloquial expressions, what we call 段子. And for example, when recounting the thought reform in 1942, called the Yan'an Rectification Movement, 延安整风运动, you quoted the phrase 脱裤子, 割尾巴, 洗澡. Take down one's pants, cut off one's bourgeois tails, and have a shower, or have a wash. And this one cracked me up. China had 站起来, stood up under Mao, 富起来, prospered up under Deng, and 强起来, power up under Xi.
That wasn't me, that was she. She said that.
So what do you intend to achieve by including those colloquial expressions?
Oh, I just think because the language is so integral to understanding China, and they're like, you know, they're like little Easter eggs for everybody who actually speaks Chinese, and the people who don't speak Chinese can still read the book. And you know, I have a thing, I think in the introduction, and now I'm not going to be able to bring it up because my brain is not doing this, but it's a quotation. You know, I say Confucius's thing about rectification of names also had to do with who has the right to talk. And I quote a, can I see my book? So I quote an ancient historian who said, yeah, Liu Xun, and he says, yeah, it's like,
见者明,
here it is. It's 当局称迷, 旁观见神, and that means it's about history, but it's using chess as a metaphor, and it says where the person who's playing the game is a little bit confused, doesn't see it. The person who's watching the game is much more clear. So that was my excuse for being able to write this book. Leaning on him.
You know, as a foreigner writing Chinese history, that's.
But you know, these
are so true. Yeah.
But these sort of sayings, these sort of things are so deeply. So many of them are so deeply embedded in the way that Chinese people have looked at their own history and culture that you can't untangle it.
Well, this is the next question. It is so much about the inside, and that's also because the book. Includes lots of your own translations from original text. And there are many qualities, when we do the translation, there are qualities in enlightenment that sometimes actually do not exist in the original text until you translate it into other language, and vice versa. So this is example, I never knew what 反修光 meant until when I was here at SBS subtitling a film, and then the person was asking the seller, 樊秀瓜多少钱一斤? How much is a kilo of anti-revisionist watermelon? Then I realized 樊秀瓜is anti-revisionist watermelon. It's because it came from 有意瓜, a friendship watermelon came from Soviet Union. So when the Soviet Union and China fell out, everything friendship became anti-revisionist. So only until I translated into English, I realized what it meant. But often, some China-specific terms, which you mentioned about the 资产阶级自由化, it means a lot more in Chinese than in English. And 资产阶级反动派, bourgeois reactionary. In Chinese, if you are 资产阶级反动派, that was a criminal offense, and that could ended up being executed. But once it's in English phrase, being a bourgeois anti-reactionary, that's not even a criminal offense.
Yeah, but then I mentioned that they get shot.
Of course. So what your thoughts on that? Because once you translate, you would see that the graveness, or it's a kind of lost in a way. And sometimes it's become absurd, but that's the other side.
No, it is always difficult, but I always would contextualize anything like that. Absolutely. You have to.
Yeah. So, this is the last question. You said at the end of the book, historically, China has flourished the most in times distinguished by their diversity and openness.
Like Tang Dynasty, for example.
Yeah. And in the intro, you also said history makes it clear that the people of this great land, in China, have always embraced a range of intellectual, philosophical, and political and cultural positions. Are you optimistic about the future of China?
It's a hard one. I think, I don't think we've really ever seen so much. I mean, the Mao era was very controlled, but they didn't have cameras, they didn't have the ability to sort of capture everything that's, you didn't have mobile phones, but I mean, today there are checkpoints in places like Xinjiang where when you pass it, they take everything off your phone. Well, they leave it there, but they can read it. Do you know what I mean? And capture it. There is such control today that it's quite horrifying. If you have any sense that, I mean, you know, I don't think Chinese people are different, you know, in the desire to be able to think and speak and live as they want. So I feel fairly safe in saying I don't think it's an imposition, a Western imposition. I think a lot of people are not living their best lives, achieving their hashtag goals at the moment. I think Xi Jinping actually is facing a very difficult time because the economy is not doing so well, because the COVID approach to COVID including by rejecting foreign developed vaccines in favor of what has turned out, sadly, to be less effective Chinese vaccines. It has slowed down this whole thing, and the insistence against. It seems that Li Keqiang, the premier, would like to see a little bit of a loosening of the approach of the COVID-0 approach to get back to a bit more economic vitality. China's at a really difficult place right now, I think. I really hope that if the economy continues to go down, we could see Xi exercise much more control, or we could see Xi replaced by somebody who wanted to go back a little bit more to the dung age of reform, that kind of, you know, like, let's get out of people's face a little bit, do you know what I mean? But it's impossible to predict. I can't predict, so I don't know whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic. I'm not terribly optimistic in the short term, that's for sure.
I think, as you said, you know, Chinese people, like everyone else, they want to live a free life, and democracy is in everyone's dream.
I don't think democracy is everyone's dream.
Yeah,
I think
okay.
that's different.
Yeah, it's people's dream.
Yeah, because as I point out in the book, there is this real thing from Mencius to this day. When you're in China and you speak to people in China, you often hear people say, oh, you know, democracy sounds fine, but, you know, 我们中国人不合适, you know, and, you know, 不治就乱. You know, people will say this to you. If we're not controlled, we'll go crazy, we'll be chaotic. And I don't necessarily believe that, but I think there's enough belief in China in this, whether it's been just inculcated through generations and generations and all that, or whether, you know, I don't know. But the fact is that democracy is a complicated dream, and liberal democracies haven't done all that well. And you know what I mean? I'm not. The United States is has killed off leaders, which China hasn't done. You know, so it's a kind of a funny thing. I just think that people do like to be free. They like to be free to be able to choose their own life. They want to be able to say what they feel like saying. They want to be able to live the way that they want to live, and that's a bit apart from trying to put a very specific other political system in that dream, you know. So I do believe there's a lot of Chinese people who would like democracy, who would flourish under democracy, but I'm not going to say that's the Chinese dream, you know.
Indeed. Well, Francis Bacon said some books are to be tasted, others to be swallowed, and some feel to be chewed and digested. This book definitely is going to be chewed and digested, and I have to say to be enjoyed as well. Please give Linda Jaivin. I'm sure it's a very successful, shortest version of Linda Javin's story. Thank you so much. Thank you, Linda.
I'm so sorry we didn't get questions.
Oh yeah. I think we're just running short. Well, to be fair to the audience, anyone who has a burning question that you have to ask? Oh, Linda, yes. Someone else you have to... Michael, do you want to ask one question? Okay, go ahead.
So does anything surprise you about contemporary China, even that you have such a very broad and in-depth understanding of China's past, that when you look at stuff like sheep and COVID, anything like that,
I think I'm always surprised by things. I mean, I also co-edit the China Story yearbook at the ANU, and we recently just published a piece on the China Story blog, which you can just get to by this woman, a Chinese woman who has used the pseudonym, which I love, Jessica Jones, which is a Marvel, sort of detective. And she's used this, and she's gone into the whole cancel culture thing in a very specific, in Zhang Zhehan, right? His being cancelled, and she talks about this whole thing among his fans, where they've been writing to the various bodies and getting answers. And on our blog, with her piece, she supplied the letters, the official letters about this whole incident. It's amazing. I read it. I was reading it and going, I love you, Jessica Jones, whoever you are. You have totally, I mean, it's not surprising in that, oh my God, but it really is surprising in the sense that there's been a ban of a popular actor for reasons that his fans think are ridiculous. And the fans, instead of being cowed as some people who might read Clive Hamilton and those sort of people think that everybody's just sitting there trembling, they've actually gone, yeah, okay, let me ask the people who banned why they banned, let's make them, and it's this whole thing, people actually can act up in certain ways, and the passion of his fans for getting to the bottom of this and making their voices heard is really interesting, given the whole political thing around it, So interesting. Can we have somebody, a Chinese person maybe, who wants to ask a question as well? Because, yes.
I'm just hearing your story and your experience, and one thing I just kept thinking back is actually how interesting that is to actually hear you talk about the people you meet and the country you visited, China. And I always believe that any insights have to be interesting, to be either useful or to be an insight. So I just think, in the context of the China-Australian relationship, and if you actually read the news or current affairs, oh my God, China is such a boring place, yeah?
Or a scary place.
How interesting how important it is for people from outside China to actually see China as interesting, not just an interesting place, but interesting in history. Apart from all the serious, stuff, there is, and as you said, the people are actually very much into intellectualism. They like to explore all sorts of things and ideas. So I just think the idea of making China interesting is quite powerful. What you're doing.
Thank you. I don't think I've made China interesting. I think China makes itself interesting.
Well, in China,
Oh,
to
it's
the
very
outside
good
world in
answer.
an interesting
Yeah,
light.
you do. Yeah. That tells all. Jocelyn has
Thank
a
you.
question.
Linda, thank you. Last night I went to a performance of the CUP stage presentation called Double Delicious. And one of the people who told something of their life story and also shared some food recipes and talking about the importance of food was Benjamin Law.
A good friend of
Yes.
mine.
And he has, his story is that he grew up in Queensland as one of very few Asian people in a small town.
And even fewer gay Asian people.
Yeah, even fewer. And then later on so he only, first of all, he thought of himself as an Australian. And then particularly after Pauline Hanson, he was identified as an Asian or a Chinese. And then he became conscious of, what it meant to be Chinese. But then when he went back to Hong Kong, he said, they laughed at him and said he was a little Aussie because his Cantonese was very accented and not very good and he couldn't read Chinese. And then he learned from his Hong Kong family and friends that they didn't identify themselves really as Chinese, they were Hong Kongers. And so he obviously ended up feeling very confused about where he belonged and said, perhaps it's my fate to be always on the margins of wherever I am. Now, my question, that's a long introduction, but my question to you is, here you are, come from Yankee land, and you've been living in China and now in Australia. Where do you feel you belong? Do you feel Australian?
Oh, totally.
And if you do, what does that mean? Because a lot of us, I'm not myself not born in Australia, but a lot of us, even those born in Australia, struggle with this question. What does it mean to be Australian?
I think there's two things. One is Benjamin Law, who I absolutely adore. He, like most interesting people, live on the margins. Like, I think a lot of really interesting people are one way or the other on the margins. Whether they're an artist or something else, But the thing about being Australian, I totally identify as Australian, and there's actually, I'm going to make this as short as I can because I can feel Jing sort of vibes coming at me here. Dragon! But I loved Australia from the moment I landed here. I was like, oh my gosh, because I never felt at home in the United States. I grew up Jewish in a time of, like, in our town, they didn't allow Jews or blacks to join any of the golf club, the sailing club, all of that. So Jews and blacks were excluded. I've always grown up on the margins. That was it, and there was just so much anti-Semitism. And then of course I wanted to be black, but of course black people were like, you're not black. So, it was kind of, and then I spent so much time in China as a non-Chinese, but sort of in it, but not in it. So I'm very comfortable with this kind of in, not in, thing. But when I came to, when it was 1989, and, I was in Nick Jose's apartment, and we had Liu Xiaobo, Hou Dejian, a whole bunch of other people that we were harboring, sheltering, whatever you want to call it. And then the tanks rolled up, and there was some tank cannon facing, you know, our window, not by purpose, but just coincident. And things were looking very dicey, and all of the Western, and a lot of the non-Western countries, they decided to evacuate their citizens. Now, at that point, I suddenly realized I wasn't yet a citizen. I'd been living here for 3 years, but I wasn't yet a citizen. I was a permanent resident. So I was like, oh shit, what if they don't let me on the plane? And so I, especially since the whole plot was like, and Ho Jian had said, you know, he said, I want you to go with me because I wasn't going to take the evacuation flight at first. I want you to go with me because I don't want to disappear. And if they take me at the airport, you're to go to Hong Kong and have a press conference and tell people I was arrested. As it turned out, Liu Xiaobo got arrested. We kept Ho Jian at the embassy. I took the plane back. But I was so nervous. I thought, what if I can't get on the Qantas flight, right? Especially after harboring Liu Xiaobo and all this stuff. So I called the American embassy at the time, because I was an American citizen, and I said, can I know what the plan is, just in case? I'm hoping not. I didn't want to be evacuated to the United States. That would be heartbreaking. I needed to come back here. But I was like, what is the plan, you know, for American citizens? And they said, oh, go and check into the Great Wall Hotel. And the Australians were saying, go to the Australian embassy and you'll stay overnight in the big ballroom thing, in the, you know, just basically everybody's going to bunk out there. I said, oh, what do you mean? Like, what if I can't afford to stay in the Great Wall Hotel? It was the most expensive hotel in Beijing at the time. And I said, I can't even do that on my credit card. And they said, well, we can't help you. And I said, what do you mean? I said, if you're going to have a meeting point and I need to get on the American evacuation flight, can you tell me the meeting point? Like the lobby of the Great Wall Hotel? I could do that. And they said, nope. You have to check in. I said, wait a minute, can I just get this right? And I asked her 3 times. I said, are you telling me that the only people you care about, that the United States government cares about rescuing in a situation like this, are the people rich enough to stay in the most expensive hotel in Beijing? And she said, that's the rules. And I repeated it 3 times. I was so furious. Meanwhile, all the Australians, including diplomats I knew and everybody else, said like, Linda, you're going to get on the flight. Don't worry about it. Of course we're going to get you back to Australia. And of course they did. But that just made me go, yeah, I know there's children here, so I won't swear, but I said, you, United States, you're out of my life, and I immediately got my Australian citizenship, and I've identified with Australia ever since.
Thank you, Linda. We are starting the second round of a Linda Jaivin story, so we have to invite Linda back again. So, you know, as I said, I promised, and Linda has so many interesting stories. Thank you again so much, Linda.
Thank you all.
Thank you. We can go back and we'll enjoy the music.